First, I want to thank everyone here for participating. By doing so, you're not only acknowledging me, you're recognizing our family and our greater community. Because if we don't acknowledge one another, no one else will. So, in my view, this virtual event is about all of us and our collective literary contributions and interests. So, thank you, and may God bless you for contributing your time and attention. Now, about the book, as you know, it's a short story collection entitled Dash, Young Black Refugee and Migration Stories. I wrote it over several years, and it took 5 years before being accepted for publication. It was long listed by the Santa Fe Writers Project in 2018 for their writing award. And the way Santa Fe, I mean, these writing competitions usually attract hundreds of submissions. In the case of Santa Fe, it was about close to 800, 780 or something like that, which is an extraordinary number of submissions. I don't suggest anybody to try to go the contest route if you think if you want to get published quickly. So out of the almost 800, they list the top 10% are long listed. So that was about 78. And I was among those 78. And then they cut it down to the short list, which is about, I think, 25 or 30. Then they have a top 10, and then they have a final award. So I was in the top 10% for Santa Fe. This collection was. This collection was also a finalist, a top 10 finalist for the Catherine Ann Porter Short Story Award. And if you know Catherine Ann Porter, she's one of the most well-known American short story writers. She lived in the first half of the 20th century. And in fact, I think she spent her declining years here in the DC area. And so it was one of the top 10 finalists. I don't remember exactly how many were in that competition, maybe a couple of hundred, two or 300. And Dash was the only, out of the top 10 finalists, the only African-American entry that made it to final status, but it wasn't selected for the final award. But I guess that shows that there was some interest in the topic. Okay, it is published. Dash is published by Unsolicited Press, which is a small independent publisher based in Portland, Oregon. It's staffed mostly by volunteers, and it's dedicated to supporting writers and fighting against systemic oppression. I could say a lot more about Unsolicited Press. They've been very supportive. They have a comprehensive marketing plan. I'm really impressed with what they've done so far. They didn't pay me any money, but a lot of small presses, they don't pay advances, or if they do, it's only a few $1,000s. But if I earn anything, it would be from royalties. But that's neither here nor there, because small presses tend to operate that way. And if you go to the Unsolicited Press website, you'll see that they sometimes use salty language. But President Obama did too. He was known to have a really foul mouth, cursing people out at the White House. Unsolicited Press peppers some of their communications with that. But in terms of their mission and what their interests are in terms of supporting writers, and the contract that they gave me was excellent. I mean, in terms of the royalties that I would get if there are sales. So that's where they're based. But Dash is a relatively short book comprised of 7 stories. It's intended for older, young adults, as well as adults. And all of the stories are about refugees or migration of some sort or other. Most of the characters are good people running from evil. A few are outlaws or partners in an unjust cause. The portrayals presented in the stories link the past hardships of Black refugees and migrants, that is African American primarily, refugees and migrants, and the causes of those hardships, and the hardships of contemporary refugees and migrants we hear and read about daily on the news worldwide. Because of this, it's my hope that these stories will transform the way some of us perceive and respond to humanitarian crises as they unfold. At the end of the book, there are story notes, and each set of story notes are for each story that include background information and questions for facilitating further discussion and research. Educators and young adults may find them especially helpful in planning lessons, classroom activities, and assignments. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. So, those of us who haven't read the book, we'd like to hear a few readings. If you have a story you'd like to share with us for a few minutes, I think you're going to share from two different stories. And I think what was interesting about the book is that a lot of the stories are intermixed with each other. So I can't wait for you guys to read this book. So could you share with us a reading from your latest title? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna read from two. I would actually like to do three, but we may not have time. I'm just gonna do these two, and rather than just read a passage, I want to kind of explain what I've done in the story that makes it special to me. And one of the stories is entitled Shamika on the Bridge, and it deals with issues of gentrification. But in this story, in addition to the characters, the story basically mostly takes place in a supermarket, in an upscale supermarket, or an upgraded supermarket, I would say, of a local Washington, D.C. chain. I've changed the name, but it's just like any big chain that you might have in your city, whether it's Pathmark or Safeway. We have Giant down here. You have Jewel, Kroger, all of these big chains. So in this case, it's I call it Maxi Fresh, but it is a giant supermarket that was upgraded in a gentrifying neighborhood. And what I think is special about the story, especially for me, is the supermarket itself is a character. Like usually you don't have a place that's a character in the story. You do run across it, but it's a little bit unusual. So I'm going to read from the passage dealing with the supermarket as a character in the story. Mainstream shoppers go to the supermarket to buy groceries and such. But for many of those living on the margins of society, the neighborhood supermarket is much more than that. In addition to being a food oasis, perhaps the only place within miles to find affordable fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, and other groceries, it supports a small but vital underground economy that mainstream society is oblivious of, and most politicians dismiss as nothing more than ghetto mess. And that was the case for Shamika's old supermarket, the 32-year-old Maxi Fresh that the new store replaced. The previous store, called the Ghetto Maxi Fresh by those who scorn the poor and desperate, or the Little Maxi Fresh by longtime residents, was run down and often filled with drama. But for Shamika and many other low-income residents of Washington, D.C.'s Shaw neighborhood, it was both a grocery store and a vital business center. It was in the Little Maxi Fresh that Shamika had worked her hustle for several years, exchanging food stamp or SNAP credits on her electronic benefits transfer cards at a discount for cash, a practice that violated a slew of federal and local laws and policies. The aisles of that store were nothing less to her than the floor of the New York Stock Exchange is to its traders. It was 2 weeks before the permanent closing of the Little Maxi Fresh that Shamika last hustled its aisles. And then I described an encounter that she has with a young man in the store who agrees to exchange cash in exchange for her paying for his groceries on her card because she needs the cash in order to pay rent. And I'm just going to skip over that encounter and continue to tell you about the store. As Shamika worked one aisle of the Little Maxi Fresh, in the next aisle over, Mrs. Jenkins, the ever-present elderly widow in a motorized wheelchair, might be found soliciting cash handouts from everyone she encountered with directness, sincerity, down-home engagement, and a storyline as equally strong as Shamika's. And in yet another aisle, Stamp Man might be found hawking postage stamps at a deep discount. Stamps? Anybody need stamps? He whispers along the aisle. Much cheaper than the post office. I got forever stamps at half price. Many customers routinely bought his stamps, not knowing or caring how he got them. This was the actual guy I met. He was walking down the aisle selling stamps. He was saying, stamps, stamps. And I stopped him. I said, are you looking for stamps? Because you got to go up to the service. He said, no, I'm selling stamps. Do you want to buy some stamps? I said, oh, no, I don't need any stamps. He was very upset with me for wasting his time. There were no checkout terminals in the Little Maxi Fresh. You can't put those damn things in a neighborhood like this, Shamika had once heard the manager tell his assistant who pitched the idea. We'd be asking for trouble. Half the items would never get scammed. Hell no. Rarely were there taxi cabs out in front of the old supermarket. Few customers could afford them. Instead, a group of ever-present retired gents in Kango caps provided super cheap rides to nearby streets for a couple of bucks, or whatever you can give me. While at the far end of the store's outdoor parking lot, brand new children's clothing, sportswear, shoes, and pirated videos of the latest movies could be bought for bargain prices from the trunk of some guy's car or the back of his van. It's just some stuff that fell off the truck, one such hustler explained as to the source of his goods. And I go on a little further in describing what the supermarket is and how important a supermarket is to a neighborhood where the people are living on the edge of society, on the margins. That's Shamika. And the story Shamika, so Shamika begins, the story starts out with Shamika going into the new supermarket where you don't have any of that stuff. And she has to navigate to find a way to figure out how she could survive the way she used to in a changing neighborhood where all of these new people are. Okay, this other story, which is, I think in this book is my favorite story, but it's kind of, it's quirky. It's about a young man named Nathan whose family, his mother and father, are lynched during a union organizing meeting in Arkansas. And this story commemorates the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, which was one of the biggest mass lynchings in American history. And these are things that they didn't teach us while we were in school. So Nathan's at home, and in the middle of the night, the sheriff and some landowners come to the house to tell him that his parents have been killed. And if you read the history, is these people were organizing, they're all sharecroppers, and they're organizing a union in order to get fair payment for their work. And this was in the early 1920s. But this story, this story, I kind of changed the time frame because I needed to bring it up to the 1960s. But it's the same dynamic. So before they go to the meeting, his parents tell him that if they don't return, they know how dangerous it is. It's sort of just like organizing a voter drive or something during that period in the South. They tell him that if they don't return, that he should run. And if you read Isabel Wilkerson's In Search of Warmer Suns, you find that this is a common occurrence that Black people in the Deep South, because they owed money to the landowners, often had, if they wanted to leave, they had to run in the middle of the night. They had to pack up everything, or even they didn't have anything at all. If they wanted to go north, they didn't have permission because they were in perpetual debt, and so they couldn't just leave. If they tried to leave, they could get arrested or they could get lynched. So they tell him to run, and that's what he did. And he runs to New York City. He gets on a train and he goes to New York City. And what I did with this story is, of course, he's distraught. He's in grief. His sister lives in Harlem, and that's where they tell him to go. And he, in the middle of the night, he leaves. He makes his way to Little Rock. He gets on the train and he goes to New York. And when he gets to New York, he sees all of this strange stuff going on that he's not familiar with, but he doesn't know. He's disoriented. And so on that first night, he's having a hard time going to sleep, but he finally gets to sleep. And I infuse the story with what you might call magical realism. Some call it magic realism. And it certainly has surrealism, where you have some aspect of, I guess surrealism or something, some magic that transfers across dimensions, from one dimension to another, and actually takes form. So he gets to his sister's apartment, Lulu, in Harlem, and he's not able to sleep well. He's not able to get to sleep because of the all-night sidewalk noise outside of his bedroom window. But just after 3 a.m., he finally descends into the depths of sleep. But even then, he found no peace of mind because his mind's eye continued to stir. In the far-off darkness of his subconscious, he was still wide awake, but in another dimension. Sensing himself trapped up to his waist in delta mud in the middle of a cotton field, he opened his mouth to scream in terror, but no sound emitted from his throat. Though unable to move or speak, he could see through the darkness with the sharp vision of a creature of the night. The earth between the rows of cotton plants lay before him as smooth and solid as polished marble. Ever so faintly, chanting began to stream through the void of darkness. Baba, Baba, Umi, Umi, Baba. Baba, Baba, Umi, Umi, Arkan. Umi, Umi, Arkan, Nefs. The chanting grew louder and soon was at a deafening pitch, reverberating through the dark void. From the darkest point between the rows, directly in front of Nathan, a light appeared. It looked like the headlight of a motor vehicle of some sort. Nathan was certain the light was racing towards him because it was getting larger by the second, and a rumbling engine sound grew louder as the light became larger and more brilliant. When the light reached the size of a spotlight, the thing transporting it stopped advancing. It turned to Nathan's right and pulled forward, revealing itself as the locomotive of a massive train in the middle of a cotton field. The train's rail cars stretched back into the furthest depths of the darkness. Through the open doors and windows, he could see the ghostly forms of several old men, Africans with full beards and twisted locks draping down from their heads onto their shoulders. Long mud cloth robes stretched from their shoulders to their sandaled feet, enshrouding their bodies in orange, black, and tan tribal motifs. It is they who were continuing to chant the song of the night with deep, guttural voices. Baba Baba Umi Umi Baba. Baba Baba Umi Umi Arkan. Umi Umi Arkan Naps. Through the wide windows of the second car, the spirit images of Nathan's mother and father, slightly smiling, peered out at him. Crowding behind his parents throughout that car and the follow on cars that were visible to him stood the spirit images of countless other souls from their Delta homeland. Some Nathan clearly recognized as departed neighbors who had been victims of the lynching. All the others were intuitively understood as being departed souls as well. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and in the silence that settled over the scene, Nathan's parents spoke to him. Arkan, Arkan Baba, Umi Arkan. Seek thee salvation in your ark. Nathan tried to speak back to them, but still no voice emitted from his mouth. The ghostly men began chanting again as the train began to move, rumbling its way atop the polished earth back to the void. As it receded into the darkness, its image faded to black, leaving only rumbling behind. And then there was a series of high-pitched screams. Arr! 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 The rumbling fire engine racing down the avenue rattled the window panes of the bedroom as its siren seared into Nathan's brain like a lightning bolt. Sweating profusely, he propped up in the bed and pressed his hands over his ears. Nathan opened his eyes to the realization that the Delta train vision was over. He was back in Harlem. And so in this instance, Nathan is 17 years old and he has this vision, and they give him these mysterious words. And some of my stories are very nuanced. Like uh, if you knew Arabic or any Afro-Asiatic language, which includes Amharic, um, Hebrew, and several other languages, Somalian, like I said, Arabic, then you know that these words have some meaning. These, they sound like gibberish to you if you don't know. I'm reading them to you. But anyway, Nathan wakes up, and the next day he goes out and he visits a bookstore. But while he's walking around, he's chanting these words. These words came to him from his parents from another dimension. He's chanting these words, and the bookstore owner, a scholar, a black scholar, he asked Nathan, he said, where did you get those words from? And he said, he tells him, where he heard them. And the man tells him what the words mean, and it ends up with a mentoring relationship that helps Nathan to find his way in the new city and to determine how he wants to live. And so you have this message that sort of like magically transfers from one dimension to another and helps this young man. And so that's kind of special for me. That's just one part of the story. So I just wanted to share those with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Wonderful. We can't wait to read the rest of them, right, everybody? Yes. I really enjoyed Shamika on the Bridge. To me, it gave an inside view on things that I see when I go to the market, and then putting a face and a personality and a story behind that. And then what does it feel like to be, left behind in a gentrifying neighborhood where things are moving, people are moving on, and you have to seek a way out of no way. And everything has changed. And then how do we change, and how us as Black people have a spirit that was born to adapt. We adapt to everything every day in our office, in our workplaces, in our society. So that story really meant a lot to me. I would like to ask you a few questions, And then we're going to open it up to anyone else who wants to ask questions, either about the two stories you've heard, or perhaps about the total collection of stories, the writing process, and those kind of things. So my first question for you is about the book. What inspired you to write a young adult short story collection? Now, it's not specifically for young adults, but it is designed and compiled so that young adults can enjoy it and study it and have discussion groups. What inspired you to write this collection about Black refugees specifically and migration?
Yeah, it's very surreal the way it came about. I didn't really have uh, a plan to write just about Black refugees and migrants. I was planning to write a book, and I have a whole bunch of other story titles and a couple of stories. I was planning to write a book about people who live on the margins, and the title of the collection was "From the Margins of Our Dream," about people who live on the margins of the American dream, and it included the elderly, um, mentally challenged people, and a couple of other types of people. And I was going to make that this collection. But the more stories I wrote, the more I realized that most of them were about the African American experience specifically. And when I started this, so I retired from law practice in 2014, at the beginning of 2014. And that's when I started writing these stories. And I was sending them out to individually to publishers, you know, through contests, which really kind of turned out to be somewhat of a waste of money because you never know. Like I said, hundreds of people submit stories for these contests, and all you get back is like a few $100s, and they might publish your story. And it's good to have your story published. It's better if you're going to do it to just send your stories directly to publishers, and if they like it, then they'll publish it. And a lot of them, they might pay you $50, $100, or $200, but then you're published. And eventually, when you publish your stories, you can say that several of these were published in these other literary journals or magazines. But I didn't do it that way. I sent them through contests. And I told you about the two where there was some recognition, and I began to realize that the focus really is on the African American experience. And at that same time, the lead story, Dash, which is about this little girl and her tribe who's running from uh, a demon army that wants to turn her into a sex slave, and to enslave all of her people. That's the first story, and it started out at the same time that the is it Chibok girls in Nigeria and the Yazidi people in Syria were being hunted down and enslaved. And I began to relate it to our own experience. And so I started making these connections. And so, like, I have a nonprofit, the Intercultural Institute of Intercultural Relations, and I think about culture and how cultures relate to one another. And so then I started to market it as a collection of Black stories. So it kind of like fell into place. And it took, like I said, about 5 years before a publisher picked it up. And I actually had stopped sending it out. I put it aside, and I had started on a new project because I think I sent it out to about less than a dozen publishers, and I didn't hear anything back. And so I was ready to move on and just consider that that's not going to be published. But that was a mistake, because since then I started reading about other people. And this one man, he sent out his collection 55 times, and he kept getting rejected. And his wife kept making him send it out again. And on the 56th time, he got published. They paid him money and everything. So So persistence is what it takes. You have to be persevering, but even more than persistence, even more than being published, the most important thing is being true to your art. Write what you like, what you're interested in, what you want to do, because that's why you're doing it. You're not doing it to please somebody else. Unless you're writing, I would say, nonfiction, like how to do, how to books or something like that, or travel guides, things like that, or scholarly journals. But as far as creative fiction, creative writing is concerned, or poetry for that matter, they say that a novelist is a failed short story writer because they couldn't reduce their work to a smaller, say the same thing. And they say that a short story writer is a failed poet because he couldn't reduce this work to a nice, succinct poem packed with energy. But I think all of those forms of genres are valid, and you just have to stick to it and do what you're interested in. But also, you have to be persistent if you're going to be published. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I know. And we have some authors with us here and some poets, and I'm sure they could attest to that as well. Um, so the book Dash is a collection of short stories, but how many stories are there? And, what are some of the basic themes of the stories? Just, in case we wanted to share the book and tell people about it.
Yeah. So there are 7 stories. Um, the lead story is Dash, about the young girl that I told you about, and they're on the run. And the second story is Brother Man. Brother Man is a member of a hated religious um, minority in his community, but he believes in helping others. And he's targeted. He and his family are targeted for their unusual faith tradition, for no other reason except that they want to be righteous. We have stories in our religious tradition where people are hated constantly through history, through different scenarios, because they want to be clean and pure. And this is how Brother Man is. And I like Brother Man is a good story. Then there's Shamika on the bridge, who's trying to transition her hustle in a new upscale supermarket where you don't have Stamp Man, you don't have the widow in the wheelchair, you don't have this other stuff going on. You have security guards who will stop her and not allow her to do that. In the old supermarket, the security guards were usually off-duty police, cops with shotguns and pistols. And in that old supermarket, those cops, yeah, I used to go there all the time, Veronica. Those cops didn't care if you were hustling. They knew that the hustlers were coming in, doing things, and they were just a part of the atmosphere. They were more concerned about armed robbers and shoplifters. And they would greet her, if they knew her name. Hey, Shamika, good to see you today. She could do her thing. In the new upscale supermarket, they want to stop her, right? She's a hood rat. She's ghetto trash, and we don't want her in this supermarket. And so she has to deal with that. Nathan's arc is the one I just told you about, the 17-year-old boy who runs in the middle of the night to New York City. And it's a coming of age story. He's trying to find his way. The Legend of Cherokee Joe is the 4th story, and it's about a multi-ethnic outlaw gang on the run. And a lot of people don't know about. So we've always had gangs. Wherever you have poverty and orphans and stuff, you have gangs all over the world. And this is a cowboy gang led by a black, a multi-ethnic Cherokee African-American outlaw. And they're on the run, of course, because lawmen are chasing them, and he has to find a way to escape. And he's actually, Cherokee Joe is the son of the girl in the first story, Dash. Her name is Arabella. She grows up, she gets married, she has this son who turns out to be Cherokee Joe. The Sorcerer's Mirage It's about a young man who leaves his home city and he joins a holy army that's out conquering other people and taking their land because he wants to create um, a, a utopia for himself and for his people. And the last story is so Dash is told in the first person. Arabella, the young girl who's running, she's telling you her story. This is what's happening to me. My name is Arabella, and my daddy is leading this group, and we're going somewhere, and I don't know where. That's in the first person. All the other stories are in the third person. He, she, or it is doing this, that, or the other. The last story, Obliterated, is told in the first person, and it's told by a nameless teenager. I never give you his name, and he's fleeing from Haiti to the United States on a boat, and I go into what our immigration system is like and how Black immigrants are treated. Those are the 7 stories. And then I have story notes, as I said, for each story there are story notes, why I wrote the story, research you can do, links to other information about some of the issues that are raised in the story. That makes it good for teaching in high school, upper grades, and I say college, and in any kind of writing programs in graduate school as well. And I think it's suitable for adults for casual reading as well.
Yes, and definitely for book groups and discussion groups. I know in my organization with the library, we're talking a lot about anti-racism and white supremacy. And I think a lot of the stories that are told in Dash could speak to people who want to learn more about that, about why groups have migrated around the United States. And then I like to learn, about things that I didn't know before. So I knew that there was a population of Black people who had escaped from slavery and went into Mexico, and that Mexico had protected those peoples and that they had lived there and integrated with the culture somewhat. But you have people who are Black and still living in Mexico for generation upon generation for hundreds of years now, and they speak Spanish and everything else too, and the cultures have integrated. And that's why what I enjoyed also about your book is that I could tell it was well researched. And could you tell us something a little bit about your process for selecting these stories? You said you wrote a lot of different stories. How did you select these stories? And during the editing process, how did you kind of bring them together into one collection?
Yeah, so all of them, I do a lot of research. I might you could spend weeks just looking up one fact, like how something is done. Um, for Shamika, for instance, that's based on actually an actual historical event, how a supermarket was replaced with an upscale supermarket and the politicians that were involved. And I actually met those people, and I say so in my notes. I met Shamika. Shamika came up to me. She didn't tell me her name was Shamika, but she's my Shamika. And she said, "Look, brother, you want to trade in some, my on my food stamp card, blah blah blah." And I couldn't do it because I was working as an attorney, and if they had caught me, you know, in some kind of sting or something, I would lose my job, my license, and everything. But I knew her and I knew her type. I met the woman in the wheelchair. I met Stamp Man, so I kind of knew about those things. And then I had to research on gentrification and what's taking place. So I guess I would say if a current event or historical event that I happen to come across in the news or in my personal encounter resonated with me, uh, I started writing notes about it. And I can honestly say that all of this kind of fell together, almost like divine intervention. I wasn't planning it, it just coalesced and it came together. And even with the fact that a Portland, Oregon publisher picked it up, and Portland is the epicenter of Black Lives Matter. I mean, I can't explain it. I can't explain how all came together. It just did. So, but the big challenge is trying to figure out how to get school systems, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, other big organizations, church reading groups to discover that it exists and to read it.
Great. Thank you for sharing. So we want to open it up to 2 or 3 questions from you guys. If you have a question, please just unmute yourself and start talking.
Hello. I have a question about your character creation. I want to know which character is your favorite in your book and why.
So I don't know if you read Dash. In the beginning of Dash, Arabella is telling you her relationship with her father, and they favor each other, and they play this peekaboo game. She's 12 years old, so emotionally she's younger than 12. Intellectually, she's much brighter and more advanced than any 12-year-old, but she has this relationship with her dad. And when he comes around, she hides her face and she peeks at him, and he teases her, and that is my granddaughter, Jasmine. She used to live with me, and every morning when I came downstairs, if she was at the breakfast table watching Sesame Street or something, she would hide her face, and she, as if like an ostrich that sticks its head in, the proverbial ostrich. If I stick my head in this hole, you can't see me. And so that's how she would hide her face, and she thought she was hiding from me, and I would stand there and stare at her, and so all of the affection between those two characters is the affection that I have with my granddaughter Jasmine, who's now an adult, or will be in another month, another year, 12 months. But that was my favorite, Arabella.
Thank you for that question. Who's next?
The man
I
in
guess
the
I'll ask a question. I'm really interested in the name of the book. I kind of have a feeling of what it is representing, but I just would like, I struggle with titles myself. And so I'm always curious about, why people choose the titles they choose. So I just would be interested in you talking about the title Dash.
Yeah, so Dash. So a lot of my stories, like, sort of like the Baba Umi language, relates to my self-identity as an African American Muslim, and some of the language that we use, and that's associated with Islam. So Dash is a play on the word Daesh, was the Islamic army, the Islamic State, and they were engaged at the time of chasing and tracking down the Yazidis, a tribe of people, a community of people that was trying to get away from their horrific dominance. And I use the word dash, which means to run fast, and it plays up against Daesh. And in the story, Arabella tells us that her father met with the entire tribe, and he told, and they relate the language back to her. She's way back in the crowd of the word dash. And she said, I don't know if he said dash or dash or what. I don't know if he said IS, like ISIS, or ES, or what. She said, because I was so far back, I couldn't hear it. And so what I was trying to do is do this cross-cultural thing to show that the same dynamic, the same abuse, the same conquest, enslavement that those people over there today had to experience, we had to experience, and we had to dash away from the American army.
Thank you. Aisha, any other questions?
I have a
Can
question.
Uh,
Sorry, I'm sorry, somebody else had a question.
no, Maisha, go ahead.
Yes, I think a question often asked of writers gets to who do you write for? Obviously, this book for you is something you want young people to read and be interested in. You also said that in terms of advice, be true to yourself and what's of interest to you. I once heard Toni Morrison anger a few people by saying she writes for herself. You know, she wants people to get out of it what they want to get out of it. In the back of your book, you take a lot of pains to go through and explain some things and ask some questions that seem to be, very political, about sort of political and social, this political and social situations that you observe. So my question has to do with, are you a storyteller telling a story that resonates with you, or are you seeing issues in social and political condition and building the story around that? It's a very different process.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean,
Yeah.
you take the story like the legend of Cherokee Joe, the cowboy bandits. That was just pure fun for me. I just enjoyed writing about these desperados, going up against posses and stuff like that. So I would say that whoever you are, whatever you are. So I'm kind of a social consciousness kind of person, and social justice. That's at essence, that's what I am, and so my interests are in that area. But I understand what you mean with Toni Morrison, and I agree with her. She said, I write stories that I would like to read, And then if you want to read them, that's fine. And that's kind of what I try to do. And that's why I was okay with setting the stories aside and not seeing them published at all. I don't care. I enjoy writing the story. I think Kafka died. None of his work was published. He had mounds of work. He told his best friend to burn it, and he didn't. And it became this, this collection of a valuable literary treasure. And I don't know if my stories were going to be like that, but primarily I write for me. I write about stuff that I'm interested in, and I write about important issues that need to be served. And my most, at least for in fiction, in nonfiction, then I'm looking for specific issues, political issues to address. But for fiction, I'm mostly telling a story that I think people might enjoy. So I try and infuse them with drama and action and tension, that might not normally exist in a straight historical narrative.
Tarek, I see you would like to ask a question.
I would like to ask a question, but that's all right. So when doing research for your stories, and I often find this for myself when it comes to, studying history that isn't common knowledge, and learning new things about some of the difficulties that groups of people have gone through over the world, over history, all over the world throughout history. Did you find at any point that some of these stories, the research for doing it was difficult? Did you feel it was, did you think that you had to, were there any points you had to stop researching, certain artists and certain writers? I can't read their biography at whole because it's, for lack of to quickly say, it's just depressing, you know? And did you find that sometimes doing research for some of these stories, were there any of these stories particularly hard for you to really dive into? Did any of them cause you any sort of like emotional unrest or discomfort, just learning certain facts and
Yeah,
writing about, you know, certain issues in your own gaze, you know,
yeah,
but still with that research, do you ever find that happening?
yeah. That's a good question. These stories, in terms of the research, so I try to end my stories in a way that doesn't bring you down, but the history behind all of them is quite depressing, you know, and but it's a reality that they won't put a lot of this stuff is historical. It's based on historical fact that they didn't teach me in school. They didn't. It wasn't in our history books. The teachers didn't talk about it, and even you know, growing up in Newark, where they had those horrific riots, you know, when we protested in school to the teachers, they told us to. They basically recited the myth of time that Dr. King spoke against, where he said, where they told him that just wait it out over a period of time, things will get better. And he says, that's a myth. He said, you have to confront the problems and you have to deal with them, even if it means getting beat in the head. And that's how I feel about writing these stories. So it's truth. And the funny thing about it is when I graduated from high school, they gave me Dr. King's book that debunked the myth of time, which these teachers had been telling me that I should follow. I said, well, like, you're giving me this book that says don't go by the myth of time. Um, but yeah, so when you drill down and find out what happened, what really happened, I don't include all of that in these stories, but I had to wade through a lot of abuse and horrific activity and death and carnage to come up with the story. And sometimes for days I would kind of get depressed, very depressed.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing this and sharing a part of you, a part of your creativity and your vision, your research. And I'm sure everyone here is looking forward to reading the book. We want to close out by saying thank you to everyone who attended today. We appreciate your support and your love and just sharing this time, this celebration of the birth of a new piece of work by Irshad Abdal-Haqq. Was Michelle, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, well, I wanted to say like just listening to some of the stories, I was definitely intrigued, and it kind of it's one of those books that I don't know if you're familiar with the Celestine Prophecy.
Uh-huh. Yes,
Yeah,
I am.
yeah, it's one of those. The short stories kind of take you on a journey, especially as a person of color. You know, as a Black woman, I could see myself taking a journey into each story, which is what I'm looking forward to. You know, and reading it in full. But also, you said something that was really important. You mentioned how you get turned down, from all these different companies when you're writing, and I have to say that I know just from being in close proximity to that with someone who illustrated my book, that was a very similar story. Jerry Kraft, who is like at the top of his game right now with his children's books and everything. And he was told that his book was a polemic because it was telling a story about us walking into white spaces and what that felt like. And now, it's somewhere else. So I feel like that for this book, for your stories that you're telling, that the people will get it. And I definitely felt connected, a deep connection to it. And I feel like we have to really start supporting more stories like this and authors like yourself that are telling real stories that we've actually seen. Like you said, you met Shamika. You know, you met Stamp Man. You know, those, you can feel that when you read this. It jumps off the pages because I felt it. You know, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now okay, so now we're going to close out with you, Irshad. How do we help get the word out about the book? How do we spread the word? How do we read it? Where do we get it? How do we share it with people? And then if you could share a little bit about the timeline as far as the availability of the ebook as opposed to the printed version, if you could share that timeline with us.
Yeah, so originally this book was not supposed to be published until April of 2021. And because of all of the things that were going on, I suggested to the publisher that they accelerate the publication because it's relevant to Black Lives Matter movement and other issues that are going on in the country. And they thought about it. So it's like Portland, Oregon is it's a pretty white city, and it's amazing what's going on there and why. But they immediately understood what I was saying. They said, well, this is a small press. We already have our budget is already allocated for a certain number of authors, but we can do the ebook now, because they were going to do an ebook and a paperback and next year. They said, we'll do the ebook. They jumped, head first into setting it up and getting it out right away. So that's why there's this disconnect between the hard copy and the ebook. Surprisingly, in terms of royalties, I would get more from the ebook than the paperback. And most publishers don't do that. But these people are dedicated to supporting authors, to writers. And so their standards are consistent with the Authors Guild standards, what they think should be in a contract. And so that's why you have that disconnect. But I have a website, Abdal-Haqq.com, and I will be putting more information on that website as to how you can support what I'm doing. And you can follow me on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter and you retweet, also on the website, you will you'll see my Twitter handle, and I think that's probably the best way to support me. But if you can't see this, you don't write it down. It's very easy to remember the website, Abdal-Haqq.com, and
I did put the links into the chat box.
okay.
So I put the link for Unsolicited Press to purchase the ebook, and also your website, so people can click on that now, or they can record it for later use.
And the ebook is available through a wide range of distributors. If you Google my name and the word dash, you'll see all of the distributors, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, of course, on and on. You can see them all listed there. Thank you very much for this. I was very resistant at first to do this, but it's the Black women that pulled it together and pulled me in, and it's been like that. And that's why I like to write stories about Black women and Black girls, because they are the heroes now, and this is your day. And I thank you for all your support.